Same thing. Stringed instruments, that's not true. Even with the guitars and everything else, what the finger does to get the actual pitch has to do a great deal with the shape of the hand and fingers. This is so individual. And when you're teaching, you have to keep into consideration what you have there in front of you. And then when you're teaching small children who grow, you have to watch like a hawk at what point you're going to change the size of the instrument. I always prefer to be too late in moving on rather than one bit too early. In other words, if it's too large for the child, it's not good. Better to be too small for the child. And that's why we have all these different sizes. We used to make them out of cigar boxes and rulers and things like that. But now you can buy commercial pre-violins, very sophisticated fake violins, but small. They're three-quarter size violin, they're half-size violin, they're quarter-size violin, they're eighth-size violin, and the tiniest is 16th size. And it's about like that, yes. And they work to the size of the child. And when you bring a child in to start lessons, you're very careful and usually even try out just a couple of instruments to be sure it's going to be the right size for the child when they get their real instrument. There are different size bows. You see the full-size bow, half-size bow, three-quarter size, and so forth and so on, because it has to fit the violin too. So you're constantly, when you're teaching, you have to take into consideration anatomy. Just the way with children and clothes. Right. They outgrow and you have to get a new size, and shoes even worse. You know, same thing with violins. However, beyond a full-size violin, we usually don't go because it has to do with the acoustics of the instrument. You get too big, you got a viola. And get even bigger, you get a cello. And that's too big to put under your chin, so you put a foot under it, you put the peg. If you don't feel it for yourself, you can't give it out. And also, there is this matter of chamber music where people play together. This is an interaction that's very satisfying. It's interaction between people. And you will never have a successful, let's say, ensemble if you don't get along personally.
Really?
Yeah. Basically, each one of us has what he has. There's some people, for instance, who have what we call perfect pitch. If you strike any kind of sound, they'll tell you what pitch it is. And there are people who have equally fine pitch, but it's only relative. It relates. It has to start with something. Perfect pitch doesn't start from anything. It's just anyway, out of the blue. But relative pitchers, and I happen to be a relative pitcher, you have to get your first starting pitch from some implement, like a tuning fork. And from there you can go. Then you can relate. That's why it's called relative pitch. And you can be just as fine with your pitch relationships as the perfect pitchers. Sometimes you can even, because we have variance in intonations, put it that way, decisions of number of vibrations for the given pitches. With the stringed instruments, you see, we have very subtle changes. With the piano, once you get the piano tuner who gives it to you, you got it. But the string instruments, that has come from ear-finger relationship, which is something I cannot explain to you because I don't know how we really do it. We do it. Somehow, we have this sense, we know the sound we want, and some way that finger finds it. And gets used to being in certain patterns so that you get used to it being a certain place. But it's fascinating. You will discover a very good violinist. The instrument will go out of tune while you're playing. You have to play in tune on it. You have to find that exact pitch even though the instrument's out of tune. That's subtle.
Wow.
But it happens. Sometimes it goes way out of tune, then you have to stop. If it goes too far, looking at Sasha, knowing he's had these experiences. But we have to find that pitch from what we call pitch finger. That's the only way of calling it. This relationship of what our inner ear is feeling. When I say inner ear, I don't mean physiologically. I mean what's inside is hearing. The ear has to guide the finger. Some have much more acute relationship, much more acute ears and ability to find pitch than others. And you have all different kinds of students, and you have to teach them all. And some are very hard to teach and take a long time to get. Others do it very well, that's people. You go to school in a classroom of readers. This one's going to pick it up fast, that one's going to be slow. You know, it's people. I do not have perfect pitch. I am a relative pitcher, but we all can manage to do it. And in some ways, the relative pitcher is lucky because there are times where the pitch variations in the different instruments are very subtle. And if you're playing in a group, you have to keep your ears, well, with the violin, pitch variation is very subtle. And John Jones may be playing his F sharp one hair higher than yours, but you have to match it or the ensemble is going off. And it's all done. And I don't know how we do it. There's always practicing, though. Always practicing. You can't ever stop that. If you do, you sound really, really horrible. It's amazing, in even a couple of days of difference. Really? Oh, yeah. Well, I think probably the top of the list is Fritz Kreisler, who is, of course, long gone.
Can you tell me why?
And Kreisler, have you ever heard any recordings? Oh. It was such beautiful, intimate playing. That's all I can say. Somehow when Kreisler was playing, you were hearing his voice. He wasn't always in tune, but that's all right. Intonation is something that's quite individual, actually. Most of us are not machines. He wasn't as immaculate, let's say, in intonation and technique as, let's say, Jascha Heifetz, who had this almost incredibly big technique, but wasn't the soul that Kreisler was. Somehow Kreisler's soul came across to you as his soul. It was very beautiful. I loved Szigeti. Again, his was very individual, very much more intellectual than, let's say, Kreisler, but wonderful. These are long past, of course, but we have recordings. Again, my Uncle Emil is to thank. I just know how I feel, and what I hear and what I want to hear. That's all I can tell you. And I do know I wasn't a hotshot technician, but we could still make music. You can't explain it. I don't think you can explain it. If you hear a piece of music and makes you feel a certain way, You can't always explain exactly why it's